Thank you guys so much. This is a huge pleasure for me. I love teaching. I love teaching on clinical pearls. And one of the best part about a clinical pearl is that they're easy to share and easy to implement right away. And I think a lot of times someone will take credit for a pearl, but as I got more involved with the JCO and started really researching clinical pearls and looking them up and writing papers on them and wanting to reference them, you realize that a lot of these pearls had earlier origins and they started even 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So a lot of times when I give lectures, I think people attribute pearls to me. I love teaching them, and these will all be my cases, but I want to take this lecture and thank those doctors who taught me these pearls and perhaps give them the credit that they deserve. So this is a thank you lecture to all the orthodontists that have helped me in my career, and they have been a part of my lectures for the last 5 or 6 years, and I hope to give them credit during this presentation. So thank you for this incredible opportunity. This is my office in South Riding, Virginia. I have 2 offices, one in South Riding, Virginia, and the other one in Ashburn, Virginia. My wife is on the left, Margaret. This is during my Engel induction about 14 years ago. I encourage every one of you to be an Engel orthodontist. I encourage you to be board certified. If you're board certified, I want you to recertify. These are my children, Jack, who is 9, James, my doppelganger, and Edith, who is 4. 3 years ago, I was named the 4th editor-in-chief for the Journal of Clinical Orthodontics. This was the greatest professional honor. I have waived my honorarium as editor-in-chief to support the journal. The greatest gift you could ever give to me, if you are happy with what I am trying to do in the profession to bring everyone together, is to please subscribe to the JCO. This is above and beyond more than you could ever know how much it would mean to me. So thank you for your subscription already, and thank you for considering in the future. After October, I had to step away from Facebook, but I love teaching and I love giving back. So I have kind of reintroduced clinical pearls on YouTube. So I'm a little bit late to the party on YouTube, but I do like to be able to give back on social media. So I created a YouTube channel. I hope you will follow me. And every day I post a clinical pearl. So if I get a clinical question, I may get a question today. I will make sure that it's tomorrow's clinical pearl video. They're about a minute or 2 long. So please join me on YouTube. Just subscribe to Neal Kravitz. And I will continue to post clinical pearls. This gives me an opportunity to teach on social media, but with just a little bit more privacy. So the overview of the lecture, all of my lectures have the same format. I want to start by doing a quick overview of Dr. Mershon. These are new clinical pearls, so if you've heard a clinical pearl lecture from me before, these will be new clinical pearls that I'll be sharing today. I'll also talk about management pearls, such as scheduling and staffing, and also how to deal with challenging patients. And then I'll end with a few life pearls to take home. And this is really a thank you lecture to all those orthodontists who have helped me in my career. If you see a yellow trim around the slide or a yellow image in the slide, that's a clue that I want you to pay close attention. I use yellow as a marker to help you pay close attention during the slides. As always, please give to the AOF. As Dr. Larson said, our office has completed a $50,000 pledge to the AOF. I'll be quickly making another $50,000 donation. Please give to your PAC fund. Orthodontists take time during the month of February to go to Congress and fight on your behalf. They've done so much on behalf of insurance reimbursements and also state legislators. And you can see what we've done in terms of proper remote orthodontic treatment and the fight against Smile Direct Club. The best thing you can do is do automatic monthly donations on your PAC fund. Our office donates $210 every month automatically, but you can do $50 a month. But don't just overlook that PAC fund. We need your support, and orthodontists take up so much time to devote toward fighting on your behalf. So please give to your PAC fund. We just do an automatic monthly donation. I encourage you to sign up as well. So Dr. Mershon was quite the polymath. He was an Engel School graduate. He was a past president of the AAO. I was excited to see that he was a chair at UPenn. I went to UPenn for dental school and a Ketchum Award winner. This is a lecture on clinical pearls, and his most famous clinical pearl was a removable lingual arch. This lecture on his behalf was created in 1960, and we've had some really amazing speakers. I'm quite honored to be able to join this list. Greg and Jimmy, Dr. Barentz and Dr. Nanda. Dr. Nanda gave a great talk just about an hour ago. So let's go over a few clinical pearls. Now, one of the pearls that everybody loves is attributed to my best friend, Dr. Sean Miller, who uses central and, oops, go back one second. This is a pearl from Dr. Sean Miller about using central incisor brackets on substituted canines. So on canine substitution, here we have missing lateral incisors. We've moved the canine into the lateral position. And the biggest problem you'll have on a canine substitution, this is a great test question, by the way, the biggest problem you'll have is torque. We have inadequate torque. The canine root is too prominent. It throws off the arch form. The arch looks too narrow. So the goal on a canine substitution case is not just crown reshaping. First, it's getting that torque palatal. But a lot of canine brackets have 0 degrees of torque. Flipping a canine bracket won't do anything. Instead, consider using a central incisor bracket. The upper ones have 17 degrees of palatal root torque, positive root torque. Positive means back on the bone. 17 degrees of palatal root torque. So if you use a central incisor bracket on a substituted canine, you will lose the root of that prominent canine, and it will look more like a lateral incisor. You can see on this slide, I did a little enameloplasty on that tooth before I put that flat canine bracket on. So it's very easy to know what I'm doing in my office for canine substitution. For bilateral substitution, my brackets are 1, 1, 1, 1. Can't beat that, right? Super easy to remember. 1, 1, 1, 1. Now, Dr. Marco Rosa, the amazing orthodontist from Italy, has a variation of this technique where he is going to use a flipped lower second premolar bracket. Now, the lower second premolars have 17 degrees of buccal root torque. If you flip a bracket, you reverse the torque. So now the premolar bracket has 17 degrees of palatal root torque, just like a central incisor bracket. But the advantage of using a lower 5 is it has the curved bracket base. Now this is confusing. The bracket is flipped here. The post should be gingival. It's now incisal. The torque has been reversed. It doesn't look like it's a flipped bracket, but that's a lower bracket on an upper tooth. So the orientation's not flipped, but the bracket is flipped relative to the tooth. The post is incisal. The torque is reversed. You've gone from minus 17 degrees of torque or 17 degrees of buccal root torque to positive 17 degrees of torque by flipping the bracket. So Dr. Rosa uses lower 5s flipped on the upper 3s to take advantage of the curved bracket base. Same 17 degrees of torque. Either one works great. Give these a shot. Dr. Sarver had the great pearl of if you are going to do a canine substitution case, what you should do is intrude the premolar in preparation for a veneer. Because the problem with a substitution case is you have this high, low gingival margin. You want a high, low, high gingival margin going from central to canine. But now you have this high, low, and you have this diminutive premolar in the place of a canine. It doesn't look good. So if you intrude the canine, it takes away the palatal cusp interference, and you can now bond or veneer the upper 4 and make it look like a canine. That's great. Here's my variation of this, though. A lot of my patients are not getting veneers, so how do I make a substituted premolar look like a canine? I've already told you, on the substituted canine, I'm going 1, 1, 1, 1. I'm using a central incisor bracket on the substituted 3s to add palatal root torque. But on the substituted 4s, the 4s that are now going to be 3s, here's the kicker. You don't want to move the root because a premolar bracket and a canine bracket all have 0 degrees of torque. You want to move the crown. So what you do is you move the bracket to the distal. By moving the bracket on the premolar to the distal, it rolls the tooth mesial in, it hides the unique mesial anatomy of the premolar, and it looks like a canine. So in summary, From first premolar to first premolar on a bilateral substitution case, I'm doing 1, 1, 1, 1 bracket to the distal. Say that with me. 1, 1, 1, 1 bracket to the distal. The premolar brackets to the distal, you can use a premolar bracket or a canine bracket. They have the same degrees of torque, 0 degrees. You're going to rotate it inward mesially by moving the bracket to the distal. That hides the unique mesial anatomy and makes the premolar look like a canine. You do need to do palatal cusp enameloplasty. Okay, let's take a look at that right over here. Okay. So what you can see here is the brackets to the distal. What I want you to see on this image is if you look at the left premolar, that's correct. It's rotated mesial in. That tooth will look like a canine from the frontal. The right premolar, the right substituted first premolar, you can see that embouchure between the canine and premolar. Patients do not like that look. They'll say, can you add some composite in between there? What you need to do is take that tooth and rotate it mesial inward. If you rotate that tooth mesial inward, it'll now look like a canine. You'll now focus on the mesial half of that tooth, and that's how you make a premolar look like a canine. So in summary, to make a canine look like a lateral, control the root. To make a premolar look like a canine, control the crown. Everybody get this? I'm trying to make this real simple. Okay. So here you can see 1, 1, 1, 1, all central incisor brackets, and my premolar bracket is to the distal. 1, 1, 1, 1 bracket to the distal. Here's another pearl. I'd like to credit Grant Coleman. Grant is the inventor of Isoglide. I am a huge Dr. Coleman fan, and one of the great pearls that Dr. Coleman taught me is to create 150% canine space. So when you need to make room for an impacted canine, create more space than you think, 150% space. It's okay if you temporarily lose the midline. Don't worry about that. Create a lot of space for that impacted canine. And here you can see the Isoglide spring. This is Dr. Coleman's invention. Perhaps you've walked by the Isoglide booth at this convention. If you have, say hi to Dr. Coleman. Try the Isoglide spring if you haven't already. This is a great pearl to thank Dr. Jeff Shirk for teaching me this. This is measuring a bonded retainer on the labial surface so you don't have to eyeball measure it. How many times do we have a staff member eyeball measure a bonded lingual retainer too long or too short? But you can use the labial surface to measure it on the lingual to not interfere with the etched surface. So we're measuring the bonded retainer from the midpoint of one canine to the mesial embrasure of the other canine. Let me show you. I'm going to zoom in for a second. So what we're going to do is look at the midpoint of one canine to the mesial embrasure of the other, and that will equal midpoint to midpoint on the lingual. You can do this anywhere in the mouth, any length of span. Midpoint of one end tooth to the mesial embrasure of the other end tooth on the labial equals midpoint to midpoint on the lingual. It's just a math equation based on arcs. I'd like to credit Dr. Joe for teaching me this pearl. This is adding occlusal composite on molar tubes. We know that if we add some composite here, I'm just adding an extra amount of transbond XT, which I use to bond the tube, but by adding a little bit of composite on the occlusal surface, you're adding more retention. You also create a deflection away from that tube, and you increase bond strength by 60%. When you're bonding those lower sixes or lower sevens, add a little bit of composite on the occlusal surface over the margin of the lower tubes. I went running this morning with my great friend, Dr. Russ Mullen. I hope Dr. Mullen's here today. He practices next to me in Virginia. And Dr. Mullen had a beautiful pearl for uprating mandibular second molars. Now, a lot of times when you want to uprate a second molar, a lot of people will accentuate the tube to lift it up. That's great. A lot of times people like to do a long span between the 5 and the 7. Just skip the 6. That works great too. If you have convertible tubes, that works really well. You can put an open coil spring between the 6 and the 7. That works fine. But if you're not using convertible tubes, what do? Dr. Mullen's pearl is to use a lower second premolar bracket on the mesial buccal cusp of the first molar. The mesial buccal cusp of the first molar is essentially another second premolar. And if you put a second premolar bracket on the mesial buccal cusp of the first molar, it's very easy to engage an open coil spring between the first molar and second molar to upright that second molar. Make sure you have a long cinch in your night tie wire, but you can quickly get to an 18 night tie. So if we zoom in, take a little bit of a closer look, you can see we're using another lower second premolar bracket on the mesial buccal cusp. I can quickly get in an 18 night tie with an active open coil spring to kick back that second molar. Make sure you're using a heavier night tie with a long cinch when you upright that tooth. Dr. Cope is one of my best friends. I encourage anyone who's interested in in-house aligners or 3D printing to take his in-office course. So many of the orthodontists in Virginia have taken that course, and I went with a few friends, and it's changed our practice. We simply just follow his protocol entirely. But Dr. Cope was working with Reliance because what he was doing was adding Triad gel in a used composite tube to have a proper application of this methacrylate. Now, Triad gel is no longer available, but Reliance, and I always love supporting anything from the Ganji family, has their version that's FDA approved called TKO. I encourage you guys to use this. And it has its own applicator tip. So you can use this resin for your resin turbos. If you like using band lock or ultra band lock, that's a compomer. That's a combination of resin and a glass ionomer. And remember, the ultra band lock has that fluoride release. That works just as well. And there we are using the ultra band lock on the lower first molar tubes. Now, I will tell you, if you have a patient who is brachycephalic, low plane angle, hypertonic muscle tone, don't use lower turbos. If you use lower turbos, resin turbos, staff will put globs on those lower sixes. All that patient will do is intrude those lower sixes and deepen the bite. Very scary. What you need to do on a flat mandibular plane angle is extrude the posterior teeth in the lower arch and then eventually put in a reverse curve. And you can only do that by disarticulating the anterior region. Try anterior metal turbos. These are old school, but this is the best school. Now, a bite plate works great too, but a metal turbo will deprogram those closing muscles of mastication, open up the bite in the posterior region. You can put a heavy reverse curve night tie in the lower arch, extrude those posterior teeth, and that's how you can open up the bite in a brachycephalic patient. So if you are brachycephalic, do not put lower six turbos. And people say, well, I'll use upper four turbos. That's fine. It's just fine. It's not great. Using upper 2 to 2 metal turbos will fix the problem in an hour. It's hard for patients, and you have to make sure that you keep the turbo on the same occlusal plane or you will intrude one incisor more than the other. But I highly recommend metal turbos for your deep hypertonic patients. Amanda Gallagher talked about using an expander with a bite plate. So a lot of times our patients who are very narrow are also retrognathic, and because of the retrognathia, they have a deep curvus spee. Those lower incisors have erupted into the anterior palate. So what she's done is on her expander added acrylic on the anterior bite plate. Now, these are all patients from my office, all these photos, but what Dr. Gallagher does is she uses clear acrylic in the anterior region, and this not only opens the transverse, but also opens the bite vertically and allows her to get on those lower anterior teeth earlier. So this is an expander with a bite plate function. People ask, can you do this on a Hyrax? Absolutely. Just add a Hyrax with an anterior bite plate component. She uses a Haas expander, and she uses clear acrylic. So this is the Gallagher expansion bite plate. Chris Teeters combines the expander with a Halterman appliance. So a lot of times when you have ectopic first molars, a lot of people will just extract the E's, let the sixes erupt, and then just do a pendex appliance or a pendulum appliance, or they'll put segmental brackets D, E, and 6, kick back the sixes, and then do an expander. Dr. Teeters does an expander and kicks back the molar at the same time. So he bands the E's, has Haltermans on the E's, and expands and distalizes at the same time. I highly encourage you trying the Halterman Hyrax expander. Bill Crutchfield practices right next to me in Northern Virginia. And he has a simplified way of understanding magic mouthwash. And there's many formulations of magic mouthwash. It's hard to remember what exactly is magic mouthwash. Well, I love teaching and giving mnemonics, so here's the mnemonics. BMX, like the bike. Benadryl, Maalox, and xylocaine. Benadryl, or diphenhydramine, takes away the inflammation. Maalox coats the mouth and changes the pH. And the liquid lidocaine, or the xylocaine, just numbs the mouth. Now, if the patient can't get a prescription from a compounding pharmacy of BMX, Benadryl, Maalox, and xylocaine, they can just do over-the-counter, which is just Benadryl and Maalox. It doesn't have the numbing effect, but it does have the anti-inflammatory effect and the coating effect. You don't want to use Kaopete, you want to use Maalox, but magic mouthwash is an equal mixture. 1, 1, 1. Equal mixture, equal amounts of Benadryl, Maalox, and liquid lidocaine or xylocaine. Just remember the mnemonic BMX. This is a great pearl by my great friend, Dr. Nikizis. Dr. Maz Mashiri just crushed his lecture earlier this morning, and his twin, his Invisalign great friend, Dr. Nikizis, always talks about his yin-yang attachment. Now you can see two pearls here. On the left side, I'm using a hybrid mechanic to rotate that premolar, where I'm using aligners with segmental elastic chain to rotate the upper left four. But Dr. Nikizis' pearl is to use yin-yang attachments. Look at all that space we were able to close on the right side. And this is his yin-yang attachment. What Dr. Nikizis will say is spread those attachments out. So you can say when you're writing to your Align engineer, use the Nikizis yin-yang attachment. That will help you protract those molars and translate them. We don't want to have the mesial cusp lift up and create that lateral open bite. Try the yin-yang attachment anytime you need a lot of space closure with your aligners. I highly recommend it. Dr. Al Griffin II works near me in Virginia. We're all familiar with his son, AG3, who is the inventor of Light Force. But this is his father's pearl. A lot of times when you prescribe an OSA appliance, you will throw off the occlusion. So what Dr. Griffin likes to do is also give the patient a positioner to wear in the morning. So let's say you give your patient your Somnimed or whatever type of OSA appliance they use. We know that surgery is the most effective technique, followed by CPAP, followed by OSA appliances all the way down here. But if the patient's going to use an OSA appliance and they use it like a crutch, they're really dependent on it, they will have a bite that is thrown off. So what Dr. Griffin likes to do is also give them a passive positioner and helps them resettle their bite. So they'll have them wear this for about 10 to 15 minutes in the morning. So they wear the OSA appliance during the night, and for about 10 minutes in the morning before they go to work or on the drive to work, they'll wear a positioner just to resettle that postured occlusion. Give it a nice shot. It's a nice little pearl. I saw Eric Liu walking by this morning, so I want to give him a shout out. This is Dr. Liu's great pearl he wrote in the AJO-DO years ago. Here we are using a night tie wire actively to align a tooth that's relapsed. Now this would be very easy to fix with in-house aligners or maybe labial braces for 1 or 2 weeks, but sometimes you have a patient who will not wear the aligners, who refuses braces. So here we are using a lower night tie in the upper arch for 1 week just to kick that tooth into alignment, take off this wire, then put it in a passive bonded retainer. If you take a look, I am bonding that wire actively, actually holding that taunt when I bond it, and within 1 week, it'll pop that tooth in the mouth. Now, if you let this ride for 2 or 3 months, you would actually get a gap opening between the front teeth because you'll actually expand the arch, even if you are using a lower wire in the upper arch. Try this. It works great for your non-compliant patients, particularly if you're only trying to align one tooth. Now, this is one of my favorite pearls, taught at the time by a resident. I saw Jenny about an hour ago in one of the lectures, and I wanted to let her know that she was in this presentation, but she posted on social media a eureka moment where she said, I now know why the lower fours always end up with too much mesial root tip. It's not just because of the panoramic radiograph, it's because of bracket positioning. The lower fours are the only tooth whose mesial marginal ridge is gingival relative to the distal marginal ridge. Most marginal ridges, the mesial is more occlusal than the distal, but the lower fours, the mesial marginal ridge is more gingival. It's supposed to be that way. It has a unique mesial anatomy. So we see this, we forget this uniqueness, and we try to add mesial root tip and lift up the mesial marginal ridge, and that throws the parallel root now to mesially. We cause unwanted mesial root tip by lifting up that tooth. So here's a couple things you can do. One, just push the post and line it back up. Two, don't even look at half of the tooth, or just do what I do. Know that the premolars are usually parallel. Don't mess with the root tip on your premolars when you bond the teeth. Bond the slots parallel. A lot of our teachers skipped premolars and their cases came out great, right? The old Ricketts technique. Watch out for the unique mesial anatomy on the lower fours. Do not try to lift up that mesial surface. Keep the slots parallel to the floor. Great pearl from, at the time, a resident. I loved it. This is a good pearl from my great friend, Christian Jaros. Christian is someone that I'm very close with, and he calls this phase none, playing on the term phase one. Now, those who have heard me speak before, they know that I really preach conservative care and, if possible, free orthodontic care. So here we are in our office taking a patient with a functional crossbite. This is a pseudo class 3, not a real class 3. And we are bonding some resin. You could use TKO, for example. I'm bonding 2 teeth here, and I'm creating a functional bevel. And the patient's biting on the bevel and kicking their teeth forward, much like a bonded popsicle stick. And all of a sudden, in one appointment, they can jump forward and correct the occlusion. This patient I've seen for a few years now, never needed orthodontic treatment. I've since treated all of his family. So this is a little bit of a marketing. So phase none, as Dr. Jaros would like to say. Okay, and this is resin turbo material to kick a tooth out of crossbite. So here we are, just adding a little bit of that resin material and beveling it to eliminate that functional shift. Creating a little bit of a beveled inclined plane to nudge that front tooth forward. This is a great pearl from Vishnu Raj. I talked about Dr. Raj in the last lecture about allowing that canine that's impacted on the palatal to fully erupt using that mousetrap before you move it into the arch to prevent lack of root control. So to prevent having to do this excessive torque, just extrude the canine further before you bring it into the arch. That was a great pearl. Here's another pearl from Dr. Raj where he will remove the 6th band about 2 weeks before the end of treatment and add a power chain, just skip that tooth entirely. You can even put a tube on the 7 if you wanted to, and just skip that tooth and use some elastic chain and close that band space up. So if you're using bands on a patient, for example, and you need to close band space, about 2 weeks before the debanding appointment, remove the 6th band and simply go 5 to 7 with some elastic chain and close the space, and you'll get a nice result that holds during treatment. As always, with all adult extraction cases, they need to have a clear aligner that they're given immediately. That space will open up the next day. They cannot leave the office until they pick up that clear aligner. I want them to have a clear aligner or a retainer before they leave the office. So they have to sit in the waiting room and get it, because I'm afraid within a half a day that space will reopen. And Dr. Zackerson wrote in the 1980s about the idea of bonding a pontic on a fixed retainer as a type of restorative orthodontic retainer. So here I am in my office using Bond-A-Braid and then building a tooth using that retainer like scaffolding. And I was getting pretty good at this. I was doing this in about 10 minutes, bonding these pontic teeth and building these teeth in the mouth. And then I said, why am I doing this? I can just have the lab do it. So now I have AOA Labs take a lingual retainer and add an acrylic tooth on it. So it's not a porcelain tooth, it's just a denture tooth, an acrylic tooth. I'm not prepping these teeth. I'm etching them, of course, but I'm not prepping them. So it's just a lingual retainer with an acrylic pontic on it. I call it a Maryland Bridge-like retainer. It's about $100. I make these every single week in my office for my patients. They love them. They are aware that they are temporary, but the general dentists do not want to do Maryland Bridge retainers. If they did, I would refer to them to do that instead. But they will use this as a fixed retainer with an Essex overlay in preparation for their implant a few years later. So this is a lingual retainer with an acrylic tooth on top of it. I highly recommend this. This is from AOA Labs, for example. And remember, it's prepless. And then I was doing that, and I said, well, if I'm doing this for adolescent patients, I can do this for phase 1 patients. How many times do you have a phase 1 patient with missing lateral incisors? We talked about the genetic component of missing laterals and ectopic teeth. And now you have those ectopic canines going through the central incisors. Boy, I'm going to tell you what, if you're missing laterals, your number one rule is you cannot have central incisor resorption. But you have measly ectopic canines going through the centrals, they're missing their laterals, and the patient refuses to take out their deciduous laterals and canines because they don't want to have just 2 front teeth. We all have those patients. So here I am making a retainer with Pontics on it, just so they can get out those deciduous teeth and allow for autonomous correction of their ectopic canines. So you can also do this as a retainer with Pontics in the first phase. Dr. Moshiri, I've mentioned him before, has talked about using a torquing key. AOA Labs gives you a torquing key if you need to torque the elbows of the Mara inward. Now here's the problem with the Mara retainer. I love using Mara, but it's not great if you need a lot of expansion. I said this in a previous lecture at the AO years ago. If you need a lot of expansion, I always favor a Herbst appliance. I limit my Mara expander to 10 to 14 turns. Any more than about 14 turns, the upper elbows will not engage those lower ramps. If you want to use a Mara and you want significant expansion, again, I'm using a Herbst, but if you want to use a Mara and want significant expansion, expand the upper component, then scan the upper arch and the lower arch and have the lab make the lower arch based off of the upper expanded arch, and they'll make the elbows or the ramps wide enough. Everybody understand that pearl? Okay, now what Dr. Moshiri is doing is taking a key, and how cool are these illustrations? This is a patient of mine who makes these illustrations, by the way. So taking a key, and what we're going to do is bend these elbows inward just a little bit. And by bending the elbows inward, now we're engaging the elbows and pushing the mandible or the dentition forward. You can see in the upper photo, nothing's engaging, nothing's happening. Now we're pushing those elbows forward, and now we're getting some mandibular dental advancements. Now here's another pearl. If you expand more than 14 turns, don't expand more than 14, but if you did, and you have one side that's not engaging, don't torque one side in 10 degrees. Torque both sides in 5 degrees. If you torque one side in 10 degrees, you'll shear that band off because there'll be too much pressure on that tube. So if one side's not engaging and you want to use a key to torque the elbow in, torque both sides in a little bit. Okay, that'll work great. Here's just another pearl that I like to add. Now, I don't recommend a unilateral forceps, even if you had a subdivision case. I talked about this during a previous lecture. If you have a subdivision case, I like bilateral appliances, either Herbsts or Maras or bilateral forceps. Just activate one side a little bit more. But here is my pearl. And by the way, if you're going to use a forceps, going back to Dr. Coleman, he would always use a removable TPA, what he called an RTPA, to control molar torque and prevent bite opening. But if you're going to use a forceps, my technique is to put a surgical crimpable post between the 3 and the 4. So the push rod pushes off the post and not the bracket. The problem with the forceps, and again, I'm just doing a unilateral one here, because if I show bilateral, your eyes don't focus where I want you to do. There's a post on the arch wire, and the push rod pushes off the post and not the bracket. The problem is we overactivate the forceps, we put all the pressure on the canine bracket, the bracket debonds, and the tooth rotates, and you have to start all over again. You can use a K module, that works great, or just put a crimpable post between the 3 and the 4, have the push rod push off the post, it works awesome, it takes 10 seconds, it's fail-proof, but again, this is just a teaching slide, use a bilateral forceps, even if you need unilateral activation. And my favorite pearl from the legendary orthodontist Jack Dale, which I actually call the Jack Dale rule of 10, is anytime you have 10 millimeters of crowding or 10 millimeter wide central incisors, it's a serial extraction case. I will say that again. Anytime you have 10 millimeters of crowding or 10 millimeter wide central incisors, it's a serial extraction case. For the young orthodontists in the room, if you are not familiar with the legendary Jack Dale, please make sure to look him up. Truly one of the great orthodontists to ever exist. Okay, and this is his pearl right over here that I'd like to credit him, the rule of 10 that I call. I like simple pearls that are easy to remember. I hope you guys are enjoying this talk so far. I'm having a lot of fun. Give it to you. Jeremy Smith had a great pearl. And I want to say something about it. So here we are, we have a rotated premolar, and here I am I'm in my office, I'm bonding an eyelet. You can also use a second molar tube, and we're bonding the eyelet to extrude and rotate. So in one appointment, we got the majority of rotation completed on the premolar. This is a nice alternative to doing open coil spring and segmental butt-ins with elastic chain. Now I want to say something. Most pearls are cute and fun and they work, and they're also not the best biomechanics, okay? And I think that's okay. That's okay. We're aware of it and we know that we have some work to do, but this is just a help to be used in a pinch. And I think that's how I would explain this pearl, but it works great when you have a rotated premolar that you need to quickly correct. And I saw Dr. Kuznotto, my greatest teacher. We all have that teacher that meant so much to us in our lives, and Booty Kuznotto was that teacher for me. And this is the pearl that I'd like to credit to him. This is intraoral finishing and detailing. Now there's a caveat here. You're not going to do this 6 months into treatment. If you try to do intraoral finishing bends, do a finishing bend without taking the wire out of the mouth, you will have an arch coordination problem. This is to be done a week before debonding. The patient comes in, they've scheduled for a debonding, they're like, oh, the lateral needs to be stepped out a little bit mesially. You can just do a quick mesial out, step out bend, and see them a week later. If you do this early in treatment, you will have a huge arch coordination issue. So this is to be used judiciously, probably like every clinical pearl. But this is intraoral finishing bends toward the end of treatment, the last 2 minutes of the game. And again, like Dr. Kuznotto, my other great teacher was Dr. Peter Tsai, and Peter Tsai had a slingshot elastic technique. Now, it's a little confusing here because I'm not using a different color elastic, but what he's doing on a stubborn space, now it would be much easier to use a closing loop, but on a stubborn space, he's taking an elastic chain, going around the bracket and slingshotting it back. So going from the 6 around the bracket and slingshotting it back to close that space. That space will close in the parking lot, boy. So just wrap it around the bracket, pull it back, and that will close the space. A little bit hard to see. I wish I was using a different color elastic chain, but this was a nice little technique to overcome that friction in the arch wire if you have it. And this is a credit to our great teachers, Dr. Kuznotto and Dr. Tsai, who were instrumental in my life. Dr. Jenkins is in our Angle Society. He just conducted a wonderful angle meeting a month ago in Montreal. And this is a pearl that I'd like to credit to Dr. Scott Jenkins. Many of you use the Comet Q Finisher, a great burr. It has that nice bevel in the front to get under the gingival margin. I also like the 7664 burr, just a generic burr. It's very effective. It's also very inexpensive. Comet's a great company, by the way, but you have a little bit more expensive cost. The 7664 burr works really well, but here's the pearl from Dr. Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins uses a small 7901 burr. The 7901 burr is wonderful. It's really sharp. It's great to kind of get under that gingival margin. You never get those scratches because the burr is very small, but the only downside, it's a small burr, so it takes more time to polish the teeth. I love using this burr for scooping out attachments. So it's my favorite burr to use to remove Invisalign attachments. So in my office, I'm going to use the Comet Q Finisher or the 7664 burr to remove composite on a debanding. But if I have to remove a lot of attachments, have that 7901 burr. It's also a great burr to use on a hypersensitive patient to remove their composite bonding after debonding. Because the smaller burr generates less heat, it's great to use on an anxious patient. So try also having a 7901 burr in your armamentarium. You guys are doing great. We have about 20 minutes to go, but I think we're going to finish a little bit early. This is a great illustration from my friend Brian Anderson. Those who know Brian know he is a wonderful artist. He sculpts, but here he is explaining to a parent what IPR is. I love these illustrations so much, I created a slide off of them. And Brian has been instrumental on social media teaching, but here we are explaining. This is also a great pearl for the residents who are taking their exams to remember that you will form a black triangle or an embouchure if the distance from the tooth contact point to the apical crest of the bone exceeds 5 millimeters. If the contact point from the tooth to the bone exceeds 5 millimeters, you will get a black triangle. And actually, once that black triangle or that gingival embouchure, and once that embouchure exceeds 3 millimeters visually in the mouth, it becomes an aesthetic concern. So one of the things you need to do to shorten the distance between the contact point and the apical crest is do some IPR to broaden the contact point out. It's a nice little slide to teach that principle. I want to credit the great faculty and residents at Harvard's orthodontic program who just published this pearl in the JCO, where they're using a ceramic burr made out of zirconia as an alternative to a laser for a single tooth gingivectomy. This pearl was published by a resident. So if you are a resident, I encourage you to publish in our journals. And here we are using infiltration because we're not going to get the hemostasis that we would get from a diode laser. And here we are using a ceramic burr without irritation. We want the burr to heat up. It doesn't damage the enamel, and we have a single tooth exposure without having to do a laser setup in the office. It takes a minute, and you can see a week later the gingiva looks great. So this is a ceramic burr. This is from Comet called the Ceratip, but most companies will sell a ceramic burr. I encourage you to purchase one. It's about $100. You can keep these. You don't dispose of them. You do sterilize them. It's a wonderful thing to use in your office. Don't use them in place of a laser for 3-to-3 gingivectomies. I'm still using my SpectraLase for cosmetic gingivectomies. For a single tooth gingivectomy exposure, this works great in a pinch. So thank you to my great friends at Harvard, Serjan and Andre. Thank you. Kevin Holman taught me a great pearl about not using Flex Tech in the upper arch. Now, I love everything Reliance, but the problem with using Flex Tech as an upper bonded retainer is on thick tissue phenotypes, you'll still get a diastema even though the retainer will still be bonded. So what he likes to use is use a stronger retainer in the upper arch, Bondabraid or Retanium. I actually prefer Retanium, which breaks less. So I use upper Retanium, lower Flex Tech. The reason I like Flex Tech in the lower arch is I don't need to floss it. Retanium is more rigid. You will have to use interproximal floss loops. I don't use a central incisor floss loop because I don't want to separate the two front teeth. So I just put them between the centrals and laterals, so just 2 floss loops in the upper arch. But here's a pearl. This is part of my angle studies. Permanent retainers are temporary solutions. 50% of upper bonded retainers and 20% of lower bonded retainers will fail in the first year. I'll say that again. 50% of upper bonded retainers, 20% of lower bonded retainers will fail either wire breakage or debonding within the first year. You need overlays. The true retainer is always going to be the removable retainer. Now here's a nice pearl about the legendary Dr. Rick Alexander. What Dr. Alexander would do is on his Hawley overlays, he would have the acrylic creep up over the cingulum to control that curve of speed. So his lower Hawleys actually had acrylic all the way up the cingula of the lower incisors. He also had another pearl. In his upper Hawleys or circumferentials, instead of using a hay rake or a crib for a patient with a protrusive tongue habit, he would just cut a hole in the palate. And by cutting a hole in the palate, it was like a cheap myofunctional appliance, and the patient would just put their tongue in that space opening and prevent them from thrusting their tongue forward. So if you have a patient with a forward tongue thrust or resting tongue pressure, use a Hawley, instead of with a hay rake, just carve a hole in the acrylic, in the anterior region. Works great. A nice credit to the legendary Dr. Alexander. So a few practice pearls. This is not a consultation. No matter how much technology changes, this will never be a consultation. Years ago, someone gave a lecture that said, I do consultations from the golf course. I want to tell everybody this. I've made so many mistakes in my life. I hope you've never made I hope you think I'm doing great work clinically, but I will tell you, I have made some awful clinical mistakes. And all of my clinical mistakes happened from moving too fast. Don't create systems that speed you up. Create systems that slow you down. The new clinical practice guidelines from the AAO say a virtual consultation no longer exists. Don't even use those words on your website. They are now called virtual screenings. A consultation requires an in-person examination, and you are not allowed to go from a virtual screening to an appliance delivery appointment. You must see the patient in person before you do anything on them. I will say that again. A consult mandates an in-person examination. So you can do this. It's just a meet and greet. It's just a screening. I think what happens is we make so much money in our career that it blinds us of the mistakes that we're making. We go look at all the money we're making, and we boast about it, and we talk about it on social media, and we give lectures on it. And I think sometimes when we tell ourselves how great we are, we sometimes are slow to realize all the mistakes that we are making. And that's what was happening with me. I was building my practice so fast and generating so much income. I thought I was so great because I judged myself by the number of case starts I had and the number of money that I made. And I would lecture on that to gain credibility. I'm embarrassed that I did. If you heard me speak, I'm so sorry on that. But the problem is that's how we judged ourselves. And when you judge yourself on that, you're not aware of all the things that you're doing wrong. I will tell you, being a businessman is not being a good orthodontist. Just do good orthodontics, and the business will take care of itself. My great friend, Jeff Lombard. Jeff, like Dr. Mullen, practices within a mile of me. Jeff's one of my great friends. And what Jeff taught me to do is use the wonderful consent form from the AAO. It actually has an extra box on this, and he will use this box to add information. Now, if the patient's Hispanic and you're worried about root resorption, have them initial the root resorption. If they have molar incisor hypomineralization, have them initial the decalcification. But what Dr. Lombard will do is say, the patient's got mandibular asymmetry, and write it down here so the patient doesn't blame you for the mandibular asymmetry later on in treatment. Use this box to add information, and like Dr. Gordon Barfield would do, he would even have a separate consent form for special considerations. Use that box. Take your time during the consultation. As Dr. Gerald would say, the verbal consult, that's your sword. That's the most important part. This is Dr. Mashiri in his office with a picture of attachments. How great of a consent is this? How many times have you had a patient sit down, pick up the attachment sheet when you were off getting the composite and going, what do you mean I'm getting 17 attachments? And then you have to rescan the patient. So here's Dr. Mashiri in his consultation with attachments on the front teeth saying this is what you need to get, at least during that first round of aligners. That's awesome consent. Dr. Jeff Koslowski wrote years ago about the importance of every staff member needing a camera. So we buy every staff member a camera. The DSLR cameras no longer exist. You need to get the mirrorless cameras. They're a little bit smaller. And will the staff drop them? Yes. It's the cost of living. They're about $2,500. But have staff take pictures. Take pictures every other appointment or every 3 appointments. Take pictures. If you take great records, you are unable to do bad work. Those who do not take records don't always do great work. If you take great records, you will do great work. I promise you, it's that simple. Great records equal great orthodontics. You can see the mirrorless camera on the far left is a little bit smaller and a little bit easier for the staff to use. The DSLRs are no longer in existence. My great friend Mike Thomas, Mike was truly instrumental in being there for me in my life, has a great end-of-the-year party. Legendary Cole Johnson also has an end-of-the-year party. A lot of orthodontists will do like movie theater rentals. What I like to do as a variation of Dr. Thomas's end-of-the-year party is I do an end-of-the-school-year pool party. So at the last day of school, all the pools will be filled with tubes and sunglasses, and we'll get pizza on all the neighborhood pools. It's very easy and very inexpensive. We'll fill the pools up with rafts and just disappear. And these rafts will make it on every family vacation. I promise you. Everywhere they go, these rafts, people take pictures of these rafts. So a nice inexpensive way you can do an end of the year or end of the school year party. We just ask the pools and fill them up. You don't even have to rent out the pool. You just simply fill them up. And it's a nice simple way to let your community know that you're thinking of them. Now I want to end with a few life pearls. I think if I had to simplify the 4 most important things you need to being healthy, I would like to put sleep number 1. I think you need sleep, nutrition, exercise, and a social connection. But I do think sleep is number 1. And those who know me know that I really push myself, and I would not always get good sleep, but it'd be impossible to be nutritious, and your exercise then won't matter if you're not getting sleep. And I really was only able to get healthier and kind of return back to myself once I started mandating the importance of sleep and really trying to get to sleep at the same time every day. So I think above all, sleep is so critical. And lastly, social connection. I have a great friend, Dr. Bob Kumra, who's an orthodontist in DC, and twice a week we work out together. We go to the local gym, we're on the ellipticals, but it's really more social. We're talking about life and family and work. Make sure you're having a social connection as well as eating well and exercising. But most importantly, if you have to choose between exercise and sleep, I believe the sleep is what's most important. And we're starting to realize it's not 6 hours, it's closer to 8 to 9 hours of mandatory sleep. I talked about this last year during my lecture on humility. I am the source of all of my problems, but I am the solution. Remember that. I am all of my problems, but I am the solution. Take accountability for your mistakes and you will be able to correct them. If you wanted it bad enough, you will find a way to make it happen. It's humility, not bravado, that is the marker of success. I think we're taught as residents to fake it till we make it, and we create this bravado to get us through the challenges of dental school, to get us through the challenges of fierce competition in private practice. But we really need to strip that false bravado, and actually the best orthodontists aren't walking around with the swag. Those aren't the guys that I'm following. They're not the cool guys that I'm following. I want the OGs that have been doing this for 30 years, that have a nice cadence, the humble orthodontists, the ones that are aware of their mistakes. Those are the ones that consistently put out beautiful work all the time. And those are the mentors that I choose to follow. The secret to being happy, this is my wife Margaret and my daughter Edith, just being a giver. Thank you guys so much for this wonderful opportunity. Huge honor today.